Are you still working at that book publisher, Luke? My mother, Barbara, asked in that condescending tone I knew so well, as she cut the roast beef with surgical precision. It was Sunday night at my parents' house in Westchester, and we were all gathered to meet James, my sister Sarah's new fiancé. The table was set with the good china, the kind that only came out for special occasions involving Sarah. It's a small publishing house, nothing fancy, I replied automatically, repeating the same lie I always told. James, a 34-year-old corporate lawyer with perfectly coiffed hair and a Rolex that cost more than most people's rent, smiled politely. It must be interesting working with books. What kind of material do you publish? Before I could answer, my mother laughed dismissively. Luke's always had this fantasy about writing. He still lives in that tiny apartment in Brooklyn, playing at being a writer. My name is Luke Martinez, I'm 32 years old, and my family has no idea who I really am. While they see me as the failed son who plays writer, I am actually the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers. My latest book has been adapted into a Netflix series premiering next month. I won the Pulitzer Prize at age 29, the same week my mother asked me when I was going to get a real job. But here at this table, I was just Luke, the invisible son, the footnote in my sister Sarah's brilliant family history. Sarah, at 35, was everything my parents had always wanted. A Harvard Business School graduate, vice president of an investment firm, owner of an Upper East Side apartment that was featured in Architectural Digest. Each of her accomplishments was celebrated as if it were a national holiday. James, you have to hear about Sarah's latest promotion, my father Thomas said, his eyes shining with pride. She now manages a $500 million portfolio. Can you believe it? Our daughter. I watched James nod impressively as Sarah smiled modestly. It was a performance I knew well, the perfect family celebrating the perfect daughter, while I watched from the sidelines as I always did. And Luke, Sarah said, finally turning to me with that pitying smile I hated, are you still living with those roommates? Actually, I live alone now, I corrected, omitting the fact that my tiny apartment was actually a 2-bedroom loft in Park Slope that I bought outright with the royalties from my second book. Good for you, she said, as if she were talking to a child who had finally learned to tie his shoes. James seemed uncomfortable with the dynamic, changing the subject. Do you have any plans for the holidays? Sarah and I are going to the Maldives in December, my mother announced. A girls' trip before the wedding. Sarah deserves it after working so hard. No one asked about my plans. No one ever did. The conversation flowed around me as it always did, discussions about Sarah's wedding dress, the ceremony at the country club, the honeymoon in Tuscany. I responded when necessary, smiled when appropriate, and gradually became part of the furniture. It was when James discreetly picked up his phone that something changed. He was typing something, frowning slightly. Then his eyes widened. He looked at me, then at the screen, then at me again. Excuse me, he said, interrupting my mother in the middle of a story about the florist. But Luke, are you by any chance Luke Martinez, the writer? The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. Sarah turned her head so quickly she almost knocked over her wine. My father blinked several times, as if trying to process an impossible equation. Why do you ask? I managed to say, my heart racing. James turned his phone around to show the screen. Because I just Googled your name and, man, you're famous. Your books are everywhere. Pulitzer Prize winner. Netflix series, you're a multi-millionaire. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next was the most shocking twist of my life. But at that moment, seeing the looks of total shock on my family's faces, I knew my double life was over. And for the first time in decades, I had their undivided attention. The question was, what was I going to do with her? The look on my mother's face was priceless. It was as if someone had just told her that the earth was flat and shown her irrefutable evidence. This has to be a mistake, she stammered, practically snatching the phone from James' hands. Some other Luke Martinez. It's a common name. James shook his head, scrolling through the screen. No, Mrs. Thompson. Look here, he went to Columbia, grew up in Westchester. It's him. He looked at me with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Man, your book Fractured Bonds made me cry on the plane to Chicago. Sarah was completely still, as if her brain had blue-screened. My father took off his glasses, wiped the lenses, and put them back on, as if that would change what he was seeing. Luke, my mother said, her voice rising an octave, if that were true, you would have told us. Families don't hide things like that. I laughed. A dry, bitter sound that echoed through the dining room. Families don't hide things like that. I repeated. Mom, I tried to tell you. Several times. That's ridiculous, she said, but her voice was losing its conviction. When my first short story was published in the New Yorker, I called home ecstatic. I began, my voice growing stronger. You said, "That's nice, honey," and immediately changed the subject to Sarah's promotion at work. Sarah finally found her voice. Luke, I don't remember that. Of course you don't, I replied. Because you never paid attention to anything I did. I turned to my father. Dad, do you remember when I won my first literary award? The Edmund White Award. He frowned, clearly not remembering. I was 26. I called home crying with joy. You were watching the Yankees game and said you'd call me back. You never did. Luke, my father began, but I continued. When Fractured Bonds came out and made the New York Times bestseller list, I sent you all autographed copies, with a letter explaining what it meant to me. I looked directly at my mother. You used my letter as a bookmark and never read the book. The room fell deathly silent. James was clearly uncomfortable, probably wondering what kind of family he was about to walk into. Why didn't you insist? Sarah asked, her voice small. Why didn't you say, look, this is important? The question hit me like a punch in the stomach. Because that was exactly what it was. I had learned over the years that my accomplishments weren't important enough to interrupt their perfect lives. Because, I said slowly, you taught me I wasn't important enough for that. My mother went pale. That's not true, Luke. We've always supported you. Supported me? The word came out as a laugh. You missed my graduation from Columbia because it was the same day as Sarah's tennis match. You missed my first public reading in New York because it was her anniversary. You missed the Pulitzer Prize ceremony because, I paused, letting the hurt I'd carried for years finally escape, because you didn't even know I was nominated. James was looking at my family as if he were watching a car crash in slow motion. Wait, he said slowly, you won the Pulitzer and they didn't know? Not only did they not know, I replied, but when I tried to tell them, my mother said I was fantasizing and that I should stop making up stories to impress people. The silence that followed was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. Sarah was now holding James' phone, scrolling through my Wikipedia page. Oh my God, she murmured. Luke, you're really famous. Like, famous. Define famous, I said, my voice tired. Your Netflix series has over 50 million views, James read over her shoulder. You were on the cover of Time magazine. Your books have been translated into 47 languages. My father now had his head in his hands. Luke's son, I don't understand how this happened. How did we not know? You didn't know, I replied, because you stopped asking about my life a long time ago. Every family conversation revolved around Sarah. Her successes, her problems, her relationships. I became part of the furniture. That's not fair, my mother protested, but her voice was shaky. You've always been very private. How were we supposed to know if you didn't talk? I did, I replied firmly. You just didn't listen. James cleared his throat. Sorry to intrude, but... Luke, you live in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn. I smiled for the first time that night. Actually, it's a 2-bedroom loft in Park Slope that I bought outright. It has an amazing view of Prospect Park. Cash, my mother repeated, as if the words were in another language. Book royalties are generous, I explained. Especially when your work is adapted for streaming. Sarah was now reading something on the screen, her eyes wide. Luke, it says here that you donated $2 million to literacy programs last year. 2.5 million, I corrected. But who's counting? The reality of what had happened over the years was finally crystallizing. They had systematically ignored not only my successes, but my entire life. And now, confronted with undeniable evidence of who I really was, they were having to re-evaluate decades of neglect. Luke, my father said, his voice breaking, how can we fix this? It was the question I had waited my whole life to hear. And now that it had finally come, I wasn't sure I wanted it fixed. Because for the first time in 32 years, I had their undivided attention. The question was, what would I do with that power? The answer would come sooner than any of us expected. How do we fix this? He repeated, the question echoing through the room like a funeral bell. For a moment, I considered being magnanimous. Accepting the apologies, embracing my family, and moving on as if the last 32 years could be erased with a few words. But then my mother opened her mouth again. Well, Luke, you have to admit that some of this is your fault, she said, regaining some of her usual composure. If you had been more direct about your successes. My fault. The question came out as a dangerous whisper. James looked like he wanted to hide under the table. Sarah was staring at her mother with growing horror. Mom, stop, Sarah said softly. But my mother was in full self-defense mode now, the reality too much to process. I'm just saying that communication is a two-way street. If you wanted us to know. If I wanted you to know? I stood up from my chair, my voice still controlled, but something dangerous bubbling underneath. Mom, I sent you autographed copies of my books. I called you when I won awards. I invited you to important events. You never said it was that important, she retorted, but her voice was losing steam. Pulitzer. The word exploded out of me. I literally said I won the Pulitzer Prize, and you responded with, "That's nice, honey. Sarah just became an associate partner." The silence that followed was deafening. Luke, my father tried to intervene. Your mother is just trying to understand. No, I interrupted, my voice now icy. She's trying to justify herself. Like she always has. Like she did when I missed my graduation, my first reading, my award ceremony. There was always an excuse for why Sarah was more important. James, clearly uncomfortable, tried to ease the tension. Look, maybe we can all. James, I said firmly, you seem like a nice guy. But you have no idea what you're witnessing here. I turned to my family. Do you want to know the whole truth? The truth about who I've really become? Sarah nodded hesitantly. My last book sold 3 million copies. The Netflix series based on my work has more viewers than Friends did on its premiere. I have meetings scheduled with Apple to discuss a second adaptation. I paused, letting that sink in. Last month, the president invited me to a dinner at the White House for contemporary American writers. My father turned pale. And do you know where I was when I got that invitation? I was sitting in my tiny apartment, crying because I had just left you a message about my Emmy nomination for adapted screenplay, and no one had returned my call. Emmy. Sarah murmured. I won it last week, I replied. It's on my bookshelf next to the Pulitzer you've never seen, the 3 National Book Awards you never celebrated, and the National Medal of Arts that President Obama personally presented to me. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. What started as a family dinner now felt like a courtroom. Luke, my mother said, her voice small, we didn't know. You didn't know because you chose not to know, I replied. You created a narrative where I was the failed son, and all evidence to the contrary was ignored to keep that narrative intact. James was now searching for something on his phone, his eyes widening with each new discovery. Man, he muttered, you're on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential Americans. 3rd place, I corrected. Why didn't you force us to pay attention? Sarah asked, genuinely confused. The question hit me like a punch in the stomach. Because she touched on the core of the issue, on the wound that never completely healed. Because, I said slowly, I shouldn't have to force my parents to care about me. I shouldn't have to beg for recognition from my own family. I sat down again, suddenly exhausted. You want to know why I stopped trying? It was after the Pulitzer. I was so happy, so proud. I called home 3 times that day. Mom, you were busy with something, Sarah. Dad, you were golfing. Sarah, you were in a meeting. I paused, reliving the pain of that day. So I drove 4 hours up here, showed up at the door with my award in my hands, like a 5-year-old showing off a drawing. And you know what happened? No one answered. You were watching a movie on Netflix. Mom said, "That's nice, honey," without even looking up, and asked if I could make popcorn because she didn't want to miss the scene. The pain in my voice was palpable now. I held the Pulitzer Prize, in the living room of this house, and you asked me to make popcorn. My mother began to cry silently. That's when I realized you were never going to see me. It didn't matter how successful I became, how famous I got, how many awards I won. I would always be Luke, the son who couldn't be like Sarah. That's not true, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's not. I grabbed my phone. Mom, how many times have you posted about Sarah's accomplishments on Facebook in the last 5 years? She didn't answer. I know the answer. 247 posts. I counted. I swiped through the screen. Want to know how many times you mentioned my name? 0. James' phone vibrated. He looked down at the screen and his eyes widened even more. Luke, he said hesitantly, I just got a Google alert. Apparently you're going to be on Jimmy Fallon next week. To promote my new documentary series, I confirmed. Documentary series? Sarah repeated. About dysfunctional families in America, I replied, a bitter smile touching my lips. Ironically appropriate, don't you think? It was at that moment that something changed in me. Seeing their expressions, confusion, shock, belated guilt, I realized I had a choice to make. I could accept their apologies and try to rebuild our relationship. I could move on and pretend that the last 32 years hadn't happened. Or I could finally show them, in a way they would never forget, exactly who I had become despite their neglect. The decision crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. Do you really want to know me? I asked, my voice taking on a tone that James would later describe as quietly terrifying. Yes, my father said immediately. Then you're going to find out exactly who Luke Martinez really is. And in that moment, looking at their expectant faces, I knew exactly how it was going to happen. The real revelation was just beginning. Then you're going to find out exactly who Luke Martinez really is. The words came out of my mouth with a calmness that surprised even me. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, when I would finally have my family's undivided attention. Now that it was here, I felt crystal clear about exactly what to do. Luke, my father said hesitantly, what do you mean by that? I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile I developed over the years dealing with difficult editors and hostile critics, controlled, confident, slightly dangerous. Well, I began, pulling out my phone, since you've never been interested in my life, how about a guided tour? I opened my Instagram, not my personal one, but my verified professional account with 2.8 million followers. James, I said, handing him my phone, how about you show this to my family? James took the phone and his eyes immediately widened. Holy shit, he muttered, scrolling through the screen. Luke, you have more followers than most celebrities. Language, James, my mom said automatically, but her voice was weak. Sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but look at this. He turned the phone around to show a photo of me with Stephen King at the National Book Awards. Luke is having dinner with Stephen King. Stephen King. My mom blinked several times, as if trying to process a foreign language. Keep scrolling, I instructed James, watching my family's reactions. Here he is with, wait, is that Oprah? James said, incredulous. And here, are you at the White House? With the president. Former president, I corrected. That's when I got the National Medal of Arts. Sarah had gone completely silent, her face pale. My father was leaning in to get a better look at the phone, his eyes wide behind his glasses. And here, James continued, his voice rising an octave, you're on a yacht with, is that Leonardo DiCaprio? Charity event in Cannes, I explained casually. Leo's adapting one of my short stories for the screen. The silence that followed was deafening. Luke, my mother finally murmured, why didn't you ever tell us about all these famous people you know? I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I tried, Mom. Remember when I mentioned I was having dinner with someone important in New York? You asked if it was work and changed the subject when I said yes. But you never said it was Stephen King, she protested. Because you never asked for details about anything in my life, I replied. You just assumed it wasn't important. James was now on my LinkedIn profile. Man, he said, his voice full of genuine admiration, you're on the board of 3 nonprofit organizations, you're a visiting professor at Columbia and Yale, and, wait, you have a PhD in American literature from Harvard? Postdoc, I corrected. I finished last year. My father took off his glasses and wiped them nervously. Luke, son, I don't understand. Why hide all this from us? The question I had waited my whole life to hear. And now, finally, I had the platform to answer it fully. Because, I said, my voice growing stronger, you taught me that my successes didn't matter. Every time I tried to share something important, you made me feel like I was interrupting something more important, invariably related to Sarah. Sarah finally found her voice. Luke, that's not fair. We didn't know. You didn't know because you chose not to know, I interrupted. And now I'm going to show you exactly what you've missed. I grabbed my phone back and started making calls. Hello, Marcus. I said to my publicist. It's me. I need you to send some things to an address. Yes, right now. I hung up and dialed another number. Elena? It's Luke. Remember that profile Vanity Fair wanted to do on my family? Yeah, that one. I've changed my mind. The expressions on my family's faces were indescribable. And one last call, I said, dialing again. Jimmy? It's me. About next week's interview. Would it be possible to bring some special guests? My family would like to watch me for the first time. When I hung up, there was complete silence. What did you just do? My mother asked, her voice a whisper. I organized a little demonstration, I replied calmly. You wanted to meet the real Luke Martinez? Perfect. Over the next 48 hours, you're going to find out exactly who I've become despite your neglect. James was looking at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Luke, man, maybe we should talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, I said firmly. For 3 decades, I accepted being invisible in this family. Now you're going to find out what it means to have Luke Martinez as a son and brother. My phone started ringing. It was Marcus, my publicist. Luke, he said when I answered, I just got calls from CNN, The Today Show, and Entertainment Tonight. They all want a statement about your family revelation. This is turning into national news. I looked at my family, their faces a mixture of shock and growing panic. Perfect, I replied, still maintaining eye contact with them. Schedule it all. I hung up and smiled at my family. Well, I said calmly, it looks like our little family reunion is about to get a lot more interesting. If you've been following this incredible transformation and want to see how an entire family can change when they finally see who they've always ignored, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen is going to completely redefine the concept of family justice. My mother was now visibly shaking. Luke, please, can we talk about this privately? No, I replied, my voice final. You've had 32 years to have these conversations in private. Now we're going to do it publicly. And as my phone continued to ring with calls from journalists, producers, and agents, I looked at the terrified faces of my family and felt, for the first time in decades, that I was finally in control. The real revenge was just beginning. 3 hours later, my phone had rung 47 times. 47 calls from journalists, producers, literary agents, and even an Apple executive who wanted to discuss the rights to my next book. Meanwhile, my family sat in the living room like defendants awaiting a verdict, watching every notification on my phone with growing horror. Luke, my father said for the 10th time, please, can we talk about this before it gets out of hand? It got out of hand a long time ago, Dad, I replied calmly, scrolling through the emails that kept coming in. You just weren't paying attention. That's when the doorbell rang. James, who had been visibly uncomfortable since this whole situation began, got up to answer it. We heard hushed voices at the door, then his hurried footsteps back. Luke, he said, his voice tense, there's a guy from CNN at the door. And an Entertainment Tonight van just pulled up in front of the house. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother turned white as a sheet. Oh my God, the neighbors will see. That was the whole point, I replied, standing up. You've worried about what the neighbors think for decades. Now they'll finally have something interesting to talk about when it comes to the Thompson family. Sarah was now pacing back and forth. Luke, this will ruin my professional reputation. My clients, my colleagues. Everyone will know that I treated my famous brother like trash for years. Now you're starting to understand, I said, my voice dangerously calm. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. My phone vibrated with a message from Marcus, Luke, the Today Show wants you on TV tomorrow at 7 a.m. The story is blowing up on social media. Hashtag family ignores famous writer is trending. I showed the screen to my family. Trending? My mother murmured. What does that mean? It means, I explained patiently, that millions of people are talking about how you ignored a famous son for decades. It means that our little family dynamic is now national entertainment. It was at that moment that my father did something he had never done in his life. He completely lost his composure. Enough, he shouted, standing up abruptly. Luke, stop this now. You're destroying our family over a tantrum. The silence that followed was icy. Tantrum. I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. Dad, you think this is a tantrum? I grabbed my phone and started dialing. What are you doing? Sarah asked, panic in her voice. Calling to accept the CNN interview, I replied. Since you all think this is a tantrum, how about I tell Anderson Cooper exactly what it was like growing up invisible in my own family? And no, my mother screamed, standing up so quickly she knocked over her wine. Luke, please. Please what, Mom? I paused with my finger on the call button. Please forgive you for the last 32 years? Please pretend it never happened? Please continue to be the invisible son so you can feel better about yourselves. James was now at the window, watching more vans pull up. Guys, he said hesitantly, I think we have about 5 media cars outside right now. My phone rang. It was a number I recognized immediately. Hello, Jimmy, I answered on speakerphone on purpose. How's it going? Luke. Dude, what's going on? My producer is freaking out. The story about your family is everywhere. We want to move your interview up to tomorrow night if possible. I looked at my family. They were all staring at me in absolute horror. Sure, Jimmy. It'll be my pleasure to tell the whole story. Awesome. And Luke, did your publicist mention that you can bring your family? It would be television gold, man. The audience is dying to meet them. It was at that moment that something changed in my mother's expression. It was as if she finally understood the true magnitude of what was happening. Jimmy, she said, looking at my family's faces, you know what? I've changed my mind. I think I'll go alone. Are you sure? The audience would be. I'm sure. See you tomorrow. I hung up and watched my family process what had just happened. Do you understand? I asked calmly. I could drag you all on national television and humiliate you in front of millions of people. I could tell Jimmy Fallon, Anderson Cooper, anyone with a camera, exactly how you treated me. I paused, letting it sink in. But I'm not going to do that. Sarah looked at me with confusion. Why not? Because, I said, sitting back down, the difference between us is that I don't need to humiliate you to feel important. You've taught me, through years of neglect, that true power comes from being so successful that your opinions become irrelevant. My phone vibrated with another message. It was from Netflix. Luke, I read aloud, we saw the news. We'd love to discuss a documentary series about your journey. Budget, 8 figures. I looked at my family, their expressions a mixture of shock and something that could be respect. 8 figures, my father repeated in a whisper. It's not about the money, Dad, I replied. It's about the fact that you had 32 years to get to know me, to be proud of me, to be part of my journey. Instead, you chose to ignore me until it was too late. I stood up and walked toward the door. Where are you going? My mother asked, her voice small. Back to my life, I replied. The one I built without you. I paused at the door and turned around one last time. What about the reporters outside? You can tell them that Luke Martinez has no comment about his family. Because for the first time in decades, you're not important enough to deserve my attention. And as I walked out of the house where I grew up feeling invisible, for the first time in my life, I was completely in control of the narrative. True revenge wasn't destroying them publicly. It was finally being too important to care about their opinion. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my publisher's office in Manhattan, signing the biggest contract of my career, a 5-book deal with a $15 million advance. Luke, said Patricia, my editor of 8 years, I've never seen this much buzz around an author. Whatever happened with your family has made you the most sought-after writer in America. I smiled, thinking about the irony. Decades of family neglect had made me invisible at home but visible to the whole world. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Luke, I saw your interview on the Today Show. You were amazing. Can we talk?" There were other messages from her, from my mother, from my father. Dozens of them over the past few weeks. All apologizing, trying to explain, begging for a chance to make things right. At first, I ignored them completely. I let them feel the same emptiness I had felt for 32 years. But something changed after the interview with Jimmy Fallon. During the show, Jimmy had asked a simple question. "Luke, what would you say to families who may be ignoring talent right under their noses?" My answer was spontaneous, coming from the heart, that it's never too late to really see the people we love. Sometimes we need a crisis to open our eyes. The words came out of me as if someone else were speaking. And in that moment, under the studio lights, in front of millions of viewers, I understood something fundamental. My revenge wasn't to hold a grudge forever. It was finally having the power to choose how our relationship would continue. I called Sarah that afternoon. "Luke." Her voice was heavy with emotion when she answered. "Oh my God, thank you for calling. How are you guys dealing with everything?" I asked bluntly. She sighed deeply. "Honestly? We're devastated. Mom hasn't left her room in days. Dad has canceled all his social engagements because he can't face the neighbors. And I." She paused. "I've had to see a therapist because I can't understand how I was so blind. And James. James wants to postpone the wedding," she said, her voice breaking. "He said he needs time to process the kind of family he's getting involved with." Part of me felt a dark satisfaction at hearing this. They were finally experiencing the consequences of decades of emotional neglect. But another part, the part that had grown during all those weeks of intensive therapy I did after the blowout, felt only sadness. "Sarah," I said calmly, "do you want a real chance to fix this?" "Yes," she replied immediately. "More than anything." "Then I'm going to set some conditions." Over the next 2 months, our family began intensive family therapy. Dr. Rebecca Chen, one of the best therapists in New York, guided us through the decades of dysfunction we had normalized. It was brutal. 3-hour sessions where my mother finally had to confront her obvious favoritism. Where my father admitted that he chose peace at home over standing up for his son. Where Sarah acknowledged that she had become so accustomed to being the center of attention that she didn't even notice when her brother completely disappeared. "Luke," my mother said during a particularly difficult session, "I don't know how to ask you for forgiveness for something so systematic. These weren't isolated mistakes. It was a consistent choice not to see you." It was the first time she had ever taken full responsibility, without excuses or justifications. "Mom," I replied, "forgiveness isn't something you can ask for. It's something I choose to give when I'm ready." And slowly, session after session, I began to be ready. Not because they deserved it, but because carrying all that hurt was preventing me from fully enjoying my success. The real turning point came when my father brought something to a session. "Luke," he said, pulling an old shoebox out of his bag, "I found this in the attic last week." Inside were all the things I had sent over the years. My autographed books, never opened. Letters explaining my successes, never read. Invitations to important events, never considered. "I read everything," he said, his voice breaking. "Every word. Every missed invitation. Every achievement we ignored." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Son, you've become exactly the man I always knew you would be. And we missed every moment of it." It was at that moment that something inside me finally healed. The journey of reconciliation wasn't linear. There were relapses, moments where old patterns reappeared. My mother still occasionally made comments that revealed her deep-seated prejudices about artistic careers. Sarah sometimes still dominated family conversations out of pure habit. But there was a fundamental difference now. They were aware of these moments. And more importantly, they corrected themselves. During a particularly revealing session, my mother admitted something that shocked me. "Luke, I think I was afraid of your talent. You were always so bright, so creative, so different from us. I didn't know how to relate to that. It was easier to pretend I didn't see it." This confession paved the way for deeper conversations about family insecurities, fears of inadequacy, and how toxic dynamics had been perpetuated through generations. I discovered that my paternal grandfather had treated my father the same way, ignoring his academic achievements in favor of his older brother who followed in the family business. The wound had been passed down, unconsciously, to the next generation. 6 months later, I was in the front row at Sarah and James's wedding. They had decided to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty, including honesty about our dysfunctional family. During her speech, Sarah said something I will never forget. "I always thought I was lucky to have the parents I had, the success I've had. But I've realized that the real luck is having a brother like Luke, someone who became extraordinary not because of our family, but in spite of it, and who still chose to give us a second chance." James, in his speech, added something that surprised me. "Luke taught me that true character isn't measured by how we treat those who can help us, but by how we treat those we love when no one is looking." My mother now has an entire shelf dedicated to my books in her living room. She has read them all twice, and often quotes passages in social conversation. My father watches every one of my TV interviews and records them to show his friends at the golf club. More significantly, they began to see other people around them differently. My mother volunteered to teach reading at the local library, working specifically with children whose talents were overlooked at home. My father began asking his friends' grandchildren about their dreams and aspirations, recognizing talents he would have previously ignored. The transformation wasn't limited to our family. The story of our reconciliation, shared quietly in social circles, inspired other families to re-examine their own dynamics. I received letters from parents who recognized similar patterns with their own non-favorite children. A mother in Seattle wrote to me, "Your story made me realize that I completely ignored my youngest daughter's musical talent because I was so focused on my oldest daughter's athletic achievements. We are now in family therapy, and she has taken up the piano again. They finally see me. They really see me. But the biggest transformation has been in myself." During our last family therapy session, Dr. Chun made an observation that struck me deeply. "Luke, you've spent years building walls to protect yourself from neglect. Now you need to learn to lower those defenses to allow genuine connection." She was right. Even after my family's acknowledgement, I still maintained a protective emotional distance. I had learned to be self-sufficient to the point of resisting love even when it was offered sincerely. I learned that true power doesn't come from humiliating those who hurt us, but from choosing how to respond when we finally have the chance. I learned that holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And I learned that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need forgiveness the most, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve the peace that comes with forgiveness. Last week, I got a call from Netflix offering me $50 million for the rights to my entire body of work for the next 5 years. The first call I made was to my family. "Congratulations, son," my father said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "We couldn't be more proud of you." And for the first time in 32 years, I believed him. Today, when I reflect on this entire journey, I realize that my family didn't make me the man I am despite their neglect. They made me the man I am because of it. They taught me to be self-sufficient, resilient, and to never depend on the validation of others to know my own worth. Pain taught me empathy. Rejection taught me to value genuine acceptance when it finally came. Isolation taught me to build meaningful connections with people who truly saw me. And perhaps most importantly, they taught me that true revenge isn't destroying those who hurt us, but building something so extraordinary that their opinion becomes irrelevant. In the end, I discovered that the best response to neglect is not more neglect, but rather demonstrating that we are capable of loving better, choosing better, and being better. Last month, I launched a foundation for young writers from dysfunctional families. We offer scholarships, mentoring, and most importantly, validation to talented individuals who may be overlooked at home. We already have 200 young people enrolled in the program. Sarah has become one of the foundation's leading donors. My mother actively participates in fundraising events. My father uses his accounting connections to ensure that every penny is put to good use. Our broken family has become a force for healing other broken families. If you've come this far on this incredible journey of family transformation and discovered that true power comes from conscious forgiveness and not destructive revenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real stories of overcoming adversity that prove that our greatest strength comes not from becoming like those who hurt us, but from choosing to be who they never got to be. Because in the end, the best revenge is to live well, love well, and choose compassion when we finally have the power to choose. And that may have been the best lesson of all.